Hello and welcome to a special episode of To The Point. Tomorrow is the much-awaited first full budget of the Modi government. Expectations were already great, but after yesterday's railway budget, they've shot up considerably. Many people believe the future of the Indian economy perhaps depends on what Arun Jaitley announces. Now, will he take credible steps to boost investment and growth? Will he go in for far-reaching reforms? Will he cut expenditure and better target it through Aadhaar? And what sort of roadmap will he offer for GST? Those are the key issues we shall tackle in part 2. But first, what is the state of the economy? How credible are the new growth figures? Can the finance minister meet his fiscal deficit target? Is Deepak Parekh right when he complains about ease of doing business? And will the land acquisition and insurance ordinances pass? Or could they stumble and disappoint? With me over the next 1 hour is a special panel of guests. They are the chairman of Maruti, R.C. Bhargav, the founder, chairman and CEO of Renew Power Ventures, Sumant Sinha, a former advisor to Finance Minister P. Chidambaram, Shubhashish Gangopadhyay, author, columnist and former CEO Gurcharan Das, the South Asia Bureau Chief of the Financial Times, Victor Mallet, and the Associate Editor of the Business Standard, Mihir Sharma. Let's start with the state of the economy. And Mr. Bhargav, let me put this to you. Do you accept the new growth figure of 6.9%, or do you think it's questionable because it's out of sync with what's happening in terms of investment, credit offtake, company results, exports, and of course, the latest IIP figures as well?
Well, I think they have changed the base and the system of calculating the figures. Now, if that becomes the base, we know a little bit more about the credibility of these figures, depending on how they show the growth which is going to take place this year. If that is some small incremental kind of growth, then it doesn't matter because it's a question of
But it's not small and incremental, it's jumped from 4.7 to 6.9.
But that's because of change of base.
And you think the change of base for you adequately explains it? You don't have question marks about it?
It's something which the IMF has said should be the way of calculating GDP.
So you're happy that this figure accurately reflects? You're neutral?
I'm neutral to this because it's just a number.
Victor Mallet, a lot of people are actually very puzzled by this new number. Now, Arvind Subramaniam, the chief economic advisor, was good enough to say, and I'm quoting him, I am puzzled by the new GDP growth numbers. Today at a press conference this afternoon, he's actually said people should be cautious. The outside world's interpretation of the new figures will depend very much on what papers like yours, the Financial Times, says to them. What's your judgment of the new growth figures? Credible? Or is there something very strange and mysterious and inexplicable about them?
Well, I think what Arvind Subramanian said is completely right, that the figures are puzzling, in fact. He said they should be interpreted cautiously. The growth numbers should be interpreted cautiously, and we should look at India as a recovering economy, not as a surging East Asian type economy. And I think most of the world is now aware, that the people who follow the Indian economy, that this is the case, that there is something funny about the statistics. It's not about the absolute size of the economy, it's about the growth numbers, especially the most recent growth numbers, which don't seem to make any sense. Nobody can really make sense of them, and it's going to take a few more years until the numbers settle down and we have a sort of plausible path of growth, statistically speaking, in terms of GDP. But I think, investors aren't too worried about that. What they care about is what happens to their businesses, what the real state of the economy is for their businesses, whether they can make things at a profit and whether they can export them. So, yeah, the world knows these numbers are a little bit dodgy, and maybe India is or maybe India isn't overtaking China, but clearly the economy is recovering. It's clearly growing pretty fast compared to most economies around the world.
Subhashish, I want to stick with the growth figure for one quick question to you before I move beyond it. You've been an advisor to former finance ministers, Mr. Chidambaram in his time. What would your advice be as far as these new growth figures are to Mr. Jaitley? Would you say that he should take them on board when he sets the target in his budget, which he announces tomorrow, or should he be more guided by the old figures because they're perhaps more credible? A quick answer to that.
Well, since these are government figures, obviously Jaitley has to take them on while working on the budget. But I think the interesting thing to see is that usually when such calculations or such changes in base are made, the levels increase, but the growth rates do not. Here what has happened is that the levels have not changed much, but the growth rate has increased. So, so one should be looking at these figures very, very carefully to see why this has happened. The fact that this has been done by the current government and is reporting on figures of the previous year, which was the previous government's, so I don't think there has been anything deliberately manipulated, but it is worth looking at what led to this peculiar outcome.
Let me move on beyond this figure to what many believe perhaps is the one undisputed positive element on the economic horizon, inflation. Do you accept that actually inflation has been reined in?
I think that several things have happened. The first is that fuel prices globally have fallen. The second is that overall there's been a global fall in the cost of agricultural goods, which has translated into a moderation of food inflation in India as well. And finally, there has been what appears to be a moderation in inflation, in the expectation that people have of future price rises, at least on the basis of one recent survey by the RBI. We don't know whether that's going to stay the case. So definitely it looks like prices have fallen. Though I do, Karan, want to just say that when people talk about the last growth figures as being doubtful, all they're essentially saying is that it doesn't square with what we have been saying in the past on the basis of previous figures. These new GDP figures are from a much larger set of, from a much larger database, a much more accurate database. They use the Ministry of Corporate Affairs study of all industries as opposed to a survey of only 150. They are much more accurate, and what they tend to show is that a recovery that we know is in progress now.
Come to Gurcharan Das and Suman Sinha. With the oil price at 60 and with spectrum sales, coal block sales and disinvestment picking up, despite the fact that tax revenues are still disappointing this year, do you believe the finance minister can make his 4.1% fiscal deficit target, and that really skepticism about that at this point is a little unrealistic?
Well, I do not think the figures that come out, unless there is a lot of disinvestment that is still being that has been made that we don't know, that is added up, I don't think that is going to reach the 4.1% fiscal deficit. But I don't think that's the issue now.
In other words, you're saying two things. You're saying he won't make 4.1%, but you don't think it matters that he fails. Am I right in my understanding?
That's right. That's right.
Very quickly to you, Victor Mallet, how will that go down abroad? If he misses 4.1, having guaranteed not just repeatedly, but probably just about a week ago that he would make it, will that raise controversies abroad? Will it worry rating agencies? Will it worry investors?
I would be astonished if he doesn't announce that he has met and is meeting the 4.1% figure. Everybody in the government has made it absolutely clear that this is a target that they will not and cannot and do not want to fail to meet. So I'm sure that somehow, if the figures have to be massaged in some way or not, there will definitely be an announcement of 4.1% as the achieved target, or the target that is in the process of being achieved.
It's a very interesting.
I just think that is essential for their credibility, and they know it and they've said it. And the areas where they might give a little more leeway is in future years, and that's what Arvind Subramaniam has been recommending over the past few months.
And I'll come to that in part two. I'll come to that in part two. Let me stop you there. I'll come to what happens in future years in part two, because I think it's very much a part of the second part of this discussion. Let's come, Gurcharan Das, to perhaps more disputed or contentious territory. Do you agree with Deepak Parikh's assessment that nothing much has changed on the ground, that businessmen are becoming impatient because there's no improvement in what he calls ease of doing business?
Well, I think Deepak Parikh and those businessmen were complaining, are complaining too much. I think they're impatient. And the fact is that there is a cycle which begins with sentiment, which begins with investments, and those investments lead to procurement, and procurement leads to production, and production then leads to jobs and growth. So this is a cycle that takes time. And economists have been cautioning the business community that this will take time. But I personally think that the economy is on the right track. Okay. And one shouldn't put excessive pressure on oneself. However, one should go ahead boldly to do the reforms that are needed, because Modi's mandate was 1 million jobs a month. And if he achieves that
can I stop
target,
you? I'll
he will
come
get
to
the
the reforms that are
demographic
needed
dividend.
in a moment's time. Let's focus for now in part one on what we believe is the state of the economy. And you're making an interesting point. You're saying the claim made by Deepak Parekh that in fact ease of doing business hasn't improved is A, inaccurate, and probably B, unfair, because these things take time and industrialists and businessmen should learn to wait rather than jump the gun. Have I understood you correctly?
Yes, and they have actually taken some steps which are going to help in the ease of business. But those very steps, like the portal, the e-biz portal that they have created, it is a terrific thing.
Okay.
This will also, takes time to filter down and get going in the right way.
Suman Sinha, you're another businessman on my panel today. Do you agree with Deepak Parekh that ease of business hasn't improved, that impatience instead is growing? Or do you agree, in fact, with Mr. Jaitley, and also, for that matter, Gurcharan Das, that the government is not getting credit for steps like FDI in insurance and defense, easier FDI in infrastructure, deregulation of diesel, direct benefit transfer in LPG, coal block auctions, and generally speedier, more decisive decision making? Who do you agree with? That the government has done a lot and enough? Be patient, the results will show. Or Mr. Parekh, impatience is growing, ease of business isn't improving? Suman Sinha? Oh, we don't have Suman Sinha. My apologies. Let me then put that to you, Mr. Bhargav.
Well, I think probably there's a little bit of truth in what Deepak says, but not the entire truth. Because I believe that ease of doing business has two components. One is what the central government can do, which relates essentially to tax, income tax, and customs duties and such things. And how the tax regime works across the board in the states. Now, the finance minister has been, of course, saying that the tax regime is going to be friendly, we will not do tax terrorism, that the High Court case, in the judgment in the Vodafone case will be respected and all that. But to make that percolate down to tens of thousands of income tax officers all over the country is not something which you can make happen in a few months, when there is a history of 60 years of this kind of functioning of the tax department.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the impatience Mr. Parekh talks about is correct, but to say that the government hasn't done enough is wrong. It just takes time for it to filter down.
It will take time to filter down because it will change attitudes developed over decades.
What's your stand on this? Because it's a critical issue, and it seems to me that the business community is somewhat divided. There are many who've come out in support of Mr. Parekh, and several newspapers have taken up the same position. But you're hearing today from at least Gurcharan Das and Mr. Bhargav that in fact, in terms of what the government could do, it's done quite a lot. It just takes time, and you need to be patient for it to filter down.
There is some truth to both sides. Definitely it is a case that changing the attitude of the average income tax officer, will take a really long time. My fear is that what Mr. Parekh was getting at was something deeper, which is that the government makes a lot of statements. Like, for example, the Prime Minister will say that we have ended public sector banks will be granted certain degree of independence. But a lot of what they want to have happen needs to be followed up by administrative changes as well. So if people were talking about reforming the tax department as well, reforming the nature of tax administration, as well as saying, look, this is the instruction we're giving them, then I think that people like Mr. Parekh would be inclined to give them to be a lot more patient than they're being right now.
But you're saying an interesting thing. You're saying that the right sort of instructions have been given by the political masters, but the actual reform of administration in institutions like the tax department hasn't happened.
You have to change incentives, not just instructions.
But that is something you can fault the politicians for not doing quickly enough.
They haven't started thinking about it, actually. That's what I fault them for.
Victor Mallet, where do international investors, because they're a very important component of Mr. Modi's future for growth in this country, where do they stand on this question of improved ease of business? Do they share Deepak Parekh's concern that not enough is happening? Is their impatience growing? Or do they believe that quite a lot has happened and maybe you just need to give a country like India time?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. I mean, clearly there have been some bold attempts to make administrative procedures quicker and easier, and I think most businesses have felt that in different ways and appreciate that. What there hasn't been yet is much in the way of legislation that entrenches really big, important economic reforms. And we know, I mean, there are two reasons for that. One is that I think the government was insufficiently bold in the early months when it could have done some quite dramatic liberalizing reforms. And the other problem is that even the ones that they do want to do, important things like GST and so on, and the land reform, they're now running into the problem of parliamentary blockages. Even though the government controls the lower house, the Lok Sabha, they don't control the Rajya Sabha, and that is beginning to cause problems and to sort of slow down the whole process. But in terms of the administrative stuff, I think quite a lot has been done, actually. I mean, even as a journalist, I've noticed that the sort of administrative procedures have actually been accelerated, which is good.
Okay.
But in terms of the sort of big ticket economic reforms that businesses want, those are still mostly sort of sitting on the table or have been done in the form of ordinances which have yet to become permanent, sustainable laws that people can rely on.
Subhashish, let's come to the ordinances, because actually as we talk, and this is an interesting paradox, this is happening literally in the run-up to the budget, which everyone has so many expectations of. Those ordinances, at least as far as newspaper reports...
Well, no, there is so much hype that has been created on this land acquisition and the ease with which it can be done since the law had changed last time, that I think it has now become a political process. The Land Acquisition Act, whether the earlier one or this one, is not the way to go, and so that's a much bigger debate. But as of now, I think for some form of the Land Acquisition Act has to be passed, and I think there would be some dilution of it, that has been proposed by the BJP. There will be some dilution of that. But it is important that this Land Acquisition Act, however not good it is, I think needs to be passed, because that would be a big signal as to whether the government is moving ahead or not.
Let me put something to you, Gurcharan, something that's being speculated. Now, I underline that word speculated, is that the sort of dilution you could see is that you may find an element of consent being required. Rather than it being scrapped altogether for those 5 areas, you might require, say, a 40 or 50% consent. Secondly, there might be a limit put on the quantum of land that can be acquired without consent, without the social impact clause. And perhaps of those 5 areas, one might be taken out, perhaps something to do with industrial corridors or purchase of land for hotels and for hospitals. Would that worry you if those are the sort of dilutions we see?
Yeah, it would worry me. It would worry me because the process of social impact as well as land acquisition requires a lot of state capacity. It is state capacity that we lack fundamentally in our country. And so what we are seeing is the specter of red tape.
Okay.
Red tape which can stall the process for 3 to 5 years for any land acquisition for infrastructure or whatever these 5 areas. And so I personally feel the flaw in all this, the mistake that Modi has made, is the same mistake that the UPA made. They never sold they never sold the reform to the people. They can very easily prove that even the poorest farmer's son wants a job. And this is all about jobs, this sort of investment. And if you sell this, Margaret Thatcher used to spend 80% of her time selling reforms and only 20% of time doing the reforms.
True.
So this is, this would be my advice to Modi, not to make the mistake that Manmohan Singh made. Don't try to reform by stealth.
Forgive me.
Go out there and sell the reform every day.
As far as those ordinances are concerned, if that mistake has to be made, it's probably already been made. Between now and the next few weeks in Parliament, it's probably too late to sell the reforms. Let me bring in Suman Sinha. We have him, unfortunately, on the telephone, not by video. I'm afraid that video connection is not working. We do. We have him on video as well. Mr. Sinha, we're talking about the sort of message that would be sent, paradoxically, just when the critical budget that everyone has so many hopes of is about to happen. If ordinances start to stumble. Land acquisition, we've talked about. The other one that could stumble seems to be insurance. What sort of message would go if these don't get passed, or if they have to be substantially diluted to be passed? What sort of message was that give investors? No, we don't have Suman Sinha.
Can you hear me?
I can just about hear you. Will you try that again, Mr. Sinha?
Okay. Obviously, the message that would be out would be extremely negative, simply because the government has taken place on being commerce and pro-development. And if the most important thing is done, which are these land orders and the other orders, if they're not able
Talk about the reforms that we're hoping for. I want to put to you the message the railway budget sent out. It's got very little populism, no new trains, a 10% hike in freight charges, most importantly, a commitment to put in an astonishing 8.5 lakh crore in investment over the next 5 years. What message does that send out?
I think it sent a very positive message that the way the railway budget was being done in the past, where it was more trains and more passenger stops and things of the kind, which were just not real things, but which were just to appease the passengers. I think that message has been reversed, that now things will be done much more on economic merits and what the railway needs, and that this minister is not going to come under political pressure from different lobbies to take decisions on that basis.
And in your eyes, is the message of the railway budget, which you see as a very positive message, a harbinger of what Mr. Jaitley will say tomorrow?
Well, I hope that is the general attitude of the government, that we have to take decisions even if they don't appear very popular. You know, you're talking of the land acquisition. If I just go for 1 minute, people don't seem to understand that if you want to create jobs, you can't create jobs without setting up manufacturing industries and businesses.
And land is critical.
And land is critical for that.
Which means if the land acquisition gets diluted, the message as far as you're concerned will be very negative.
Exactly. And especially, Karan, it's not the cost of the land. It's the time which it takes to acquire land which creates the big problem.
In which case, speaking as Chairman of Maruti, is the passage of the land acquisition ordinance or its translation into an act a critical test for Mr. Modi?
I think it's very important. I hope he sticks to his position that we cannot dilute the process of getting land quickly for industry.
And therefore, if he fails this test, it will be a huge minus.
Well, it's a minus on somebody in the country, not necessarily Mr. Modi.
Well, maybe Mr. Jaitley, but
No.
only those two.
No, but if they try their best and the rest of the country gangs up against it, who's it a minus for?
You're being politically generous and happy to blame the opposition for the fact that the government
Well,
failed.
that is what it is.
Okay, that may be a personal preference, but let me put this to you. I'm going back briefly to the railway budget. Are you sufficiently satisfied in your mind that the 8.5 lakh crore enormous investment that he envisages over the next 5 years, he can actually find and provide? He talks about institutional finance, he talks about pension funds, he talks about banks. What's he going to offer them to make them put money into a sector that most people had written off?
I haven't the vaguest idea, and I think that we're.
Do you think he has an idea?
I genuinely hope he does, because if Suresh Prabhu, who is one of the sort of smartest policy-making politicians that we have, doesn't have an idea, certainly nobody I've spoken to has any idea why pension funds would invest in Indian Railways. I just want to make this absolutely clear. However, I also think that there are other aspects of the budget that should worry us. I mean, I would not say that it is not populist at all. If it was genuinely not populist, he would have allowed
Passenger fares.
He wouldn't have raised freight fares at the expense of not raising passenger fares.
But not all freight fares have gone up. He's rationalized them, as he claims.
That's not quite true. Overall, freight fares will go up, and that will continue to make the railways uncompetitive as compared to trucking.
Which means you hope this is not a harbinger of what Mr. Jaitley says tomorrow.
I actually do hope that Mr. Jaitley's budget will improve on this. Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, let's take a break at that point. I'm very sorry that we still don't have Mr. Suman Sinha. Hopefully, after the break, he'll be back with us. We're going to come back, and in part two, we're going to turn to the critical reforms and the other measures in the budget that's going to be announced tomorrow that we all are hoping for. How important are they, and equally, how likely are they? Join me in a moment. Welcome back to a special episode of To The Point. It's a 1-hour program where we're looking at what we can expect tomorrow in Mr. Jaitley's full budget. Let's begin, Meher Sharma, with this question of the fiscal deficit target that he should set for the next year. Some people say that it's essential he stick by the FRBM targets, 3.6 next year, 3 the year after. Others say that given that investment is not picking up and that the private sector is loath to invest, and that credit offtake is low, the government has to step in and maybe ease the target to 3.8, 3.9. Where do you stand on that critical one?
Well, I think that the answer about what Mr. Jaitley is going to do is that he's definitely going to ease it. I mean, that seems to be what the economic survey has more than hinted at today. They've, in fact, flat out, the chief economic advisor has flat out said in the economic survey.
And would he be right to ease it?
It depends on where the extra money is going. If the extra money is in fact going into public investment, then yes, I think you could make a case for taking your time to get back to 3%.
That, of course, we'd only find out tomorrow. But Victor Mallet, how will it be taken abroad if Mr. Jaitley decides to, and I'm using that deliberate word, jettison 3.6 and go up to 3.8, 3.9?
I don't think it would be taken particularly badly. I think, if the economy is growing fast, and as Subramanian and others have suggested, the reason for the higher deficit is that the state is trying to crowd in the private sector into investing in infrastructure. In other words, to encourage others to join in and create investment where investment is lacking. I don't think that's a particular problem at the moment. And in fact, the mood globally still seems to be in favor of pouring money, state money, into liquidity everywhere. I know India's in a slightly different position, but
okay.
I don't think that will be hugely...
Program a couple of days ago, a former chief economic advisor, Shankaracharya, said that what he would like to see Mr. Jaitley do is put money into infrastructure by raising tax revenues, and he talked about increasing SENVAT, he talked about increasing service tax charges. Others have said that maybe Mr. Jaitley should issue long-term bonds for infrastructure. And a third view seems to be that maybe he should tap PSUs, who are supposed to have 2 lakhs of profits or at least surplus funds lying with them. Do you think those are more acceptable ways of boosting investment and therefore giving a fillip to the economy?
As opposed to what?
As opposed to simply increasing the fiscal deficit from 3.6 to 3.8 or 9.
Okay, now all these things that Shankar talked about have different implications for not just the raising of revenues, but say, for example, the public sector, if you're taking money off from the public sector. The problem with the public sector is that if they do have money and are not investing, now that is seriously a problem, and therefore they need to use that money to in other ways, because after all, it's the public's money.
Mr. Gurcharan Das, this is the key problem, is that the savings rate and therefore the investment rate have really fallen very precipitously in the last 7 years. The investment rate has come down to somewhere around 32% from a high 7 years ago of around 38%. He needs to boost that. What would you like Mr. Jaitley to do that suggests he's tackling this problem effectively?
Yeah, and this is where I disagree with Shankaracharya. I would not raise those tax rates. I would allow savings to grow, and I would ensure that we have the right, as Subhashish just said, have the right kind of investments in infrastructure which will kickstart growth. Once you do that, then savings will automatically begin to rise in the economy. So what is critical is to push investment and to cut consumption. And if you do that, then I think the process of growth will bring up the savings.
So you're in favor, I take it, and I'm reading between the lines, of the target being pushed up from 3.6 to 3.8 or 3.9 if Mr. Jaitley chooses to do that. Give me a quick yes or no.
Yeah. I mean, that is correct. That I wouldn't mind if it slipped by a few percentage points.
Okay.
But if we could get growth in return, it's worth it.
I want to come to the two businessmen on my panel. First, Mr. Sinha, who I believe is back with us, and then Mr. Bhargav. What would you advise the Finance Minister, Mr. Sinha, to do to fire up animal spirits, to give businessmen and investors that confidence to put their money in?
You know, Karan, I hope you can hear me this time.
I can.
Okay, great. Okay, you know, on the other question that he just asked about 3.8, 3.9 versus 3.6, I would very much advise the Finance Minister to stick to 3.6. The reason is that, you know, there is no guarantee that whatever public spending plan that they come up with is going to be efficient and effective. Because so far, people are not investing for the simple reason that there aren't good investment opportunities. Unless we see consumption begin to pick up and demand begin to pick up and the overall investment environment improving, people are not going to be investing, whether they are domestic public sector companies or they're domestic private sector companies, or in fact the foreign companies, which are probably going to be the last to join the party in any case. And so therefore there has to be a focus, a continued focus, the government already is focusing on these issues, to really continue to improve the ease of doing business and the overall business climate. And in that respect, one of the biggest contributors to that is the cost of capital. Now that today, as we all know, is very, very high. And ultimately, therefore, projects don't get off the ground because the returns required of them are very high. Now, if in fact we can stick to fiscal discipline, and if the RBI therefore continues to cut rates on the back, hopefully, of a declining inflation environment, then 2-3 things will happen. Number one, your real rates will begin to start going up, and that will then boost your savings rate. At the same time, your cost of capital will start going down, and that will then also kickstart the overall investments in the economy.
Okay.
So to me, the number one recommendation for the finance minister actually is to stick to a 3.6% fiscal deficit.
Okay.
Because that, I think, is fundamental. The second thing I would recommend to him is that he needs to then, somehow or the other, ensure that there are certain sectors where they give a fairly significant boost, either through fiscal incentives or through financial incentives. And that is something that they'll have to focus on doing, while at the same time keeping that fiscal discipline. Now, which means that they have to cut expenditure somewhere. And in the face of the 14th Finance Commission, that is going to be a harder thing to do. But I think somehow that is really where the overall ability of the finance minister has to come in.
Okay.
And they have to find room to do all of this.
I'll come to that question of where does he find the room to cut additional expenditure in a moment's time. But let me put that original question that I put to you to Mr. Bhargav. What would you like the finance minister to do to fire up animal spirits? In other words, to fire up your spirit.
Well, all of us make investments when we foresee that in the coming years there's going to be a growing demand and it's going to be easy to do business and to make profits. Which means that in terms of avoiding all kinds of unnecessary costs, a lot of this is done in the states, by the way, which is not within Mr. Jaitley's control. Don't forget that part of it, because for industrial working, the states are probably more important than the center is. And along with that, I think it's necessary that when the government makes investments, and they need to make investments, as we've been discussing, infrastructure and things, and even if you increase the deficit figure, the efficiency of that investment is something which we don't talk about. What we have seen in the past, that you start investing money into an infrastructure project, should be completed in 3 years, carries on for 6 years, has a cost overrun of 80%.
Which is why Suman Sinha was saying, don't kick up that figure.
Far worse than anything else.
So you're saying, in fact, even if you are going to take the risk of kicking up to 3.6 to 3.8, make sure efficiency,
yeah.
Which of course may not be Mr. Jaitley's capacity to control, because he's one man and the system itself is inefficient.
Exactly. So it's not Mr. Jaitley alone.
Absolutely. Let's come to this question, because it was a tantalizing thought raised by Suman Sinha about the need for the government to find space to control expenditure. Now, the Bimal Jalan Committee was appointed in the last budget to suggest cuts in subsidies and expenditure. It's given an interim report. Its final report is expected soon. Oil prices have fallen, so the government was able to deregulate diesel. Petrol was already deregulated. Do you think there's an opportunity and space to do something in terms of food grain subsidy, kerosene subsidy, fertilizer, and perhaps at least better target them, if nothing else?
I think that's definitely what they're going to try to do. I don't know about food grain subsidy. There is some the Business Standard recently reported that that the government has written to the union territories and to certain BJP ruled states to try and move towards a direct benefit transfer in urban areas, at least, of the food grain subsidy. The economic survey today argues that 10,000 crores of excess spending could be shaved off the kerosene subsidy if it was better targeted. And the fertilizer subsidy, I think we'll definitely see some kind of Aadhaar link
Are you
at the end of the year.
expecting these to happen? Economic surveys often talk about what should, but very rarely does happen.
I think that this is that all three of these will be at least promised in the budget and probably budgeted for.
So we will see substantial cuts in expenditure, possibly, and subsidies.
I expect that they will be promised.
Promised? and also an attempt to better target through Aadhaar.
Yeah.
Let's come to one or two other issues that perhaps matter, and let me start with you, Victor Mallet. Many people last time were disappointed that Mr. Jaitley had not reversed retrospective taxation. He simply promised he wouldn't do it again. Now, he's taken one further step with Vodafone. He didn't contest the Bombay High Court judgment. But do you think there's a need this time around to effectively nail this problem of retrospective taxation by simply reversing it? Or is it now no longer an issue?
No, I think it is an issue. I think it's completely an issue, and it's an issue obviously for foreign investors, including Vodafone, but also including Japanese companies, but also for Indian investors. It's still the single biggest kind of obstacle to investors having confidence in the Indian economy and in Indian governments not introducing bizarre retroactive legislation.